Daf Yomi Tractate Bava, page 79a, at the top of the page, with the words Ganav v'higdish, Ganav v'hikiv, Ganav v'hechalif, etc. The Braita continues. If he stole an animal and consecrated it, or if he stole an animal and sold it on credit, or without receiving any money for it at the time, basically on credit, yeah. Or if he stole an animal and exchanged it for another item. Or if he stole an animal and gave it to another as a gift. Or if he stole an animal and used it to repay his debt. Or if he stole an animal and used it to pay for an item he purchased on credit. Or if he stole an animal and sent it in the form of presents or present to his betrothed in his father-in-law's house. In all these cases, he pays the fourfold or fivefold payment, as these acts are all considered forms of selling. This concludes the Braita. The Gemara asks, what is this Braita teaching us? All of the halachot, it states, are obvious. The Gemara answers, the first clause teaches us, through the case of one who stole an animal and gave it to another, and that person slaughtered it or sold it on his behalf, that in this case, there is agency for transgression, meaning yesh shliach l'dvar avera. That a person, that there is a shliach for dvar avera. It will work for his sin if he sends someone to sell it. Okay. Even though in the entire Torah there is a principle that there is no agency for transgression, here there is agency for transgression. The Torah's principle is that a transgression committed by an agent who was appointed by another person is not considered the act of the one who appointed the agent, but the independent act of the agent himself. The case discussed by this Braita is an exception to the rule, as here the agent's slaughter or sale of the animal is legally considered the action of the thief. And it was mentioned in a shir today that I heard that there's another instance of yesh shliach l'dvar avera, which is in the case of me'ila, embezzling from hegdish, basically being moel b'hegdish. If someone sends somebody to take something from the temple, then the person who sent them is responsible, is liable, perhaps in addition to the one who did it. Maybe, I'm not sure what it is, but for sure the one who sent it is also. So just trying to think about what's the same about me'ila and slaughtering and selling it. I'm not sure. It's a thinker. Anyway, what is the reason that this case is an exception to the principle? It is because the verse states, and slaughters it or sells it, Exodus 21:37, which juxtaposes the two acts of slaughtering and selling. This teaches that just as one becomes liable for selling, which by definition is impossible without another party, that is the buyer, so too one becomes liable for slaughtering, even when it is by means of another party. In other words, when the thief instructs another person to slaughter the animal on his behalf. And the latter clause of the Braita teaches us a novelty in the case of one who stole an animal and consecrated it. The novelty is that this is considered a sale despite the fact that there is no purchaser. This is due to the following argument. What difference is it to me if he sold the animal to an ordinary person, and what difference is it to me if he sold it to heaven by consecrating it? If the animal changes ownership, it is considered a sale, and it does not matter if the new owner is an ordinary person or that temple treasury. New Mishnah. If one stole an animal in its owner's domain, Ganav b'rshus habaylim, that is, he took hold of it or established control over it but had not yet removed it from the owner's premises, and then he slaughtered it or sold it outside the owner's domain, or if he stole an animal outside of the owner's domain and he slaughtered it or sold it in the owner's domain, or if he stole an animal and slaughtered it and sold it, and all this occurred outside the owner's domain, in all these cases he must pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. But if he stole it and slaughtered or sold it, and all of this occurred in the owner's domain, he is exempt from any of the fines for theft, as it is not considered theft until the stolen object is actually removed from the owner's premises. It's hard to imagine how that could go on, but I guess okay. If the thief was in the process of leading the animal and leaving the owner's premises, and it died while it was still in the owner's domain, the thief is exempt from all fines. If he lifted it up or let it out of the owner's domain, and then the animal died, he is liable for his theft. For an act to be considered theft, the thief must acquire the item by pulling it or moving it, which are ineffective forms of acquisition on the owner's premises, or by lifting it up, which is effective even when he performed in the owner's domain. If the thief gave the animal as payment for the redemption of his firstborn son, or as payment to a creditor, or conveyed it for safeguarding to an unpaid bailee, or lent it to a borrower, or conveyed it for safeguarding to a paid bailee, or leased it to a renter, and he was leading out the animal, and it died in the owner's domain, the thief is exempt from all fines. If that individual, following the thief's instruction, lifted up the animal or let it out of the owner's domain and it subsequently died, the thief is liable for the theft. The thief is liable for instructing another to remove the animal for the purposes of payment of a debt, safekeeping, borrowing, or rental, as this is tantamount to the thief taking it with his own hands. Gemara. A Maimar raises a dilemma. Boy, a Maimar. Did the sages institute the requirement of pulling or leading an animal with regard to baileys or not? Meaning shomrim? When an animal or other item is purchased, the parties to the sale are not bound by the deal until the purchaser performed an act of acquisition, one of which is pulling the animal or leads it along. Did the sages institute an ordinance that the same applies to baileys? In other words, does the bailey's obligation to safeguard the animal or item begin as soon as he consents to watch it, or only after he has taken the animal and moved it, even minimally? Rav Yemar said, come in here a proof from the Mishnah. If the thief gave the animal as payment for the redemption of his firstborn son, or as payment to a creditor, or conveyed it for safeguarding to an unpaid bailee, or lent it to a borrower, or conveyed it for safeguarding to a paid bailee, or rented it to a renter, and he was leading out the animal and it died in the owner's domain, the thief is exempt from payment. What? Is it not talking about the bailee leading out the animal when it states that the thief is exempt? And if so, conclude from this Mishnah that the sages instituted the requirement of pulling with regard to bailies. If the bailie's obligation begins immediately upon his consent to watch over the item, it would be considered stolen by the thief at that stage, even before the bailee moves it. A Maimar said to Rav Yemar, no, this is not necessarily the correct interpretation of the Mishnah. The Mishnah may mean that the owner gave the animal to his creditor or to a bailee, and subsequently a thief came to steal it from the house of the creditor or the bailee, and it was the thief who was leading the animal out of those premises when it died. Rav Yemar asked, how can that clause of the Mishnah refer to an animal that died as the thief was leading it out? The Mishnah already taught this halacha in the first clause. Amaymar answered, nevertheless, it is possible that the Mishnah taught this halacha concerning a thief who stole an animal from its owner's house and then taught it again with regard to a thief who stole an animal from a bailey's house. Rav Ashi said to Amaymar, do not reject Rav Yemar's argument by means of this alternative interpretation of the Mishnah. It is not reasonable to assert that the Mishnah taught this halacha twice, as what difference is it to me if the thief stole it from the bailey's house, and what difference is it to me if the thief stole it from the owner's house? There is no halakhic distinction between these two cases. Therefore, the Mishnah would not have discussed both of them. Rather, is it not more reasonable to say that the Mishnah should be interpreted as meaning that the bailey was leading the animal out of the owner's house at the behest of the thief, as Rav Yemar claimed, and therefore one should conclude from the Mishnah that the sages instituted the requirement of pulling with regard to baileys. The Gemara affirms conclude from the Mishnah that they did. It was also stated explicitly that Rabbi Elazar says, just as the sages instituted the requirement of pulling with regard to purchasers, so too they instituted the requirement of pulling with regard to baileys. This is also taught in a Braita. Just as the sages instituted the requirement of pulling with regard to purchasers, so too they instituted the requirement of pulling with regard to baileys. And just as land is acquired by the payment of money, by the writing of a deed of sale, or by the purchaser taking possession of the land through working it, so too a rental deal is finalized by the payment of money, by the writing of a deed of rent, or by the renter taking possession of the land. This concludes the Braita. The Gemara asks, when the Braita speaks of rental, is it referring to rental of what kind of property? When the Braita speaks of rental, is referring to rental of what kind of property? If we say Shabbat Shalom,